Welcome to our final King's Talk of 2020. And what could be more appropriate given this year of turmoil than to have a talk about finance, or as I would like to refer to it as a talk to improve your mental health. Because if you improve your understanding on finances and you get better with your finances, you'll feel better about yourself. My name is Greg Hunter, and I'm the Deputy Head Co-Curricular here at King's. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Edmund Wilson, who presents Financial Life Planning in a World Worth Living. Edmund is a chartered financial planner and has a partner practice of St James's Place Wealth Management and oversees about £96 million of client money. He will be giving us a presentation in a moment, and at the end of the presentation, we'll be taking questions from you, the audience. Please, at any stage, either type your question into the Q&A function as part of Zoom, or alternatively, at the end of the presentation, please put your virtual hand up and I can put you directly into the air to speak to Edmund yourself. Now, it is with great pleasure that I welcome Edmund Wilson. Edmund.
Hey, thanks very much, Greg. It's a very kind intro. Let's just get the slides back up. Lovely to have those of you here today. And hang on, let's just oh, what's happened here? There we go. Really good to be here. This is a subject that I feel really strongly about because it's really important. You know what I do? By the way, this is not about, me generating clients, whatever. It's me just giving back to the King's community. What I do is really about what that title says on the slide. It's about enabling individuals and families to live the life that they want, doing what they want with their timeframes and their goals in a world worth living in. And that world worth living in is really important at the moment. You've just got to think of some of the stresses and strains on this world, and we'll go over some of them in a moment. There is a bit of a disclaimer there. This isn't financial advice. Investing involves risk. Your capital is at risk. Investments go down as well as up. Hey, it might not be suitable for you. It's proper financial planning is personal to the individual, their timeframes, their goals, etc., etc. So there we go. Let's get rid of that. That's what we're going to talk about. Because really, what's really important about your money is what you want to do with it. Do you want to buy a house? Do you want to go and sail around the world? Do you want to buy a ski chalet? Do you want to just, play golf? Do you want to support your family? Do you want to protect your family? All that kind of stuff. So it's really important that whatever age you are, it doesn't matter whether you're a teenager or whether you're 75, you need to think about what you want to achieve. What are your goals? Do I want to buy a car? Do I want to go on the world's best safari or cruise or whatever? Do I want to buy a house, fund my wedding or whatever it is? There'll be a little bit about global economies and demography and how life is changing in that way. A little bit about inflation. I also draw a clear line between saving, which is what you do with your cash, and investing, which is how you generate the future for yourselves. We'll talk a bit about compound growth. The climate emergency is a big deal, and we really need to pay attention to that. The effect of humankind on this planet is terrible at the moment. It's improving, but we really need to act in that regard. And then we'll talk a little bit about rising longevity and the fact that people on average run out of money 10 years before they die, which is what you'd obviously hope to avoid. So there we are. Let's think about goals for a moment. This slide is generic, and it's just got a few things that some people may want to do in terms of goals, like buying their first car or funding their gap year or buying their first property, or indeed their second or third, or buy-to-let property, helping their children onto the property ladder, spending on weddings. The average cost of a wedding at the moment is over £30,000. By the way, those of you who are parents online, you understand that having children costs money. and you've got to save for it. And then there may be some intergenerational things that might happen in the future, whether you want to help your children or help indeed your grandchildren, or whether you want your parents to help their grandchildren, your children, or indeed if you're a teenager at King's at the moment, a student, you might want your grandparents to help you. And then, of course, at the end of life, more and more of us are going to require some kind of medical care, whether it be in the home or in a residential care facility. And then above that thing, there's cash that runs through it. Every single person in this world needs to hold cash for the short term, for emergencies, to meet their expenditure requirements in the next 3, 6, 12 months, whatever it is. We all need to have cash. But then once you start getting on a bit in life, you know, when you've got a mortgage or when you've got children and things like that, it's really important that you start thinking about protecting your mortgage, protecting your family. You know, when we go on holiday, we insure our holidays, we drive a car and we insure our cars. But the thing that enables us to pay those premiums is generally our salaries and our income. So why don't we insure that? You know, people should protect and insure their income in case of ill health. And then what happens if the worst happens and you get run over by a bus or fall off the edge of a cliff? What happens to your mortgage, with your family? You may need private healthcare, or you may be worried about critical illness cover. And so that runs through your life, and it's really important. It's actually quite dull dealing with insurance, and none of us like spending money on something we might not claim on. But it's vital. You know, we all insure our cars. Why wouldn't we insure our income or indeed our health? But really fundamental to this is that if you're going to try and achieve something in the future, you need to set aside money now that's going to grow over a period of time that will in itself generate money in the future and enable you to achieve financial freedom. And what is financial freedom? Well, it's individual. I have clients who say that they have a nosebleed if they can't have £100,000 a year, but I also have a client who spends a grand total of £11,000 a year, and she makes that from state pension and a company pension, and she's really happy. It's individual, but what is absolutely cast iron guaranteed is that every single person in this world needs to set aside some money for the future. Because if you don't, you're just living for today, and there will be nothing in the future. So let's talk a little bit about global economies and demography. And I think we're at a really interesting time at the moment. There's a huge change going on in the world. And the whole center of gravity economically is moving back to the Far East, where it was actually 500 years ago. But for the last 500 years, we've had the Western world of Europe and the UK, and in the last couple of hundred years, the US, as the sort of global superpowers. And that is changing. In the West, whether it be Europe, the UK, the US, or whatever, we have trillions and trillions of dollars of government debt, which has got to be paid back at some stage in the future. Whereas in the East, they have far less of that. The Western world has got an aging and less productive population. You know, we have more and more pensioners. 6,000 people reach the age of 65 every day in this country. And that's more and more people who are a drain on the state and are increasing an increasing share of what the state has to pay, whereas the working population is smaller as a proportion. Whereas in the East, in China and the Far East and the Philippines and Thailand and things, they have a younger, more vibrant, more dynamic population, except in Japan, where that population of workers will be more productive than the working population in the UK. And I think it's pretty clear that over the next 30 years, so if you're 18 or 17 or 16 or whatever, or indeed if you're 40, in the next 30 years, the East will grow faster than the West. And that is something we all need to bear in mind. Let's think a little bit about life expectancy now as well. You could be in Mitchinson 6A having your Christmas party, as indeed this young chap is as we speak. My son, he's 18 and a month odd. He's got an average life expectancy of 86 years old with a 25% chance of getting to 96 and a 10% chance of getting to 100. For people born today, they've got a 50% chance of getting to 100. So if you think about it, he's not even going to get access to his state pension until he's 68. And it's going to be, on average, an 18-year retirement that he's got to fund. But it may well be a 20 or 30-year retirement that he's got to fund. Yeah, that's a third of his working life, or half of his working life almost. And we've got to do something to encourage people to set aside money to fund that future. And auto-enrollment has helped with that, with employer pensions, but the earlier you start, the better. We've also got to think about inflation, because inflation is a fact. It's pretty low at the moment. It's about 0.7%, but the government target is 2% a year, and I think over the next few years it's going to rise quite considerably. But the fact is that inflation does erode the value of your money. And £10,000 20 years ago is the same as £6,600 today. That means your £10,000 20 years ago has lost 34% of its buying power. And what we've all got to do is try and put money aside that'll get an investment return that's higher than inflation, because otherwise we get a real terms reduction in what we've got, and cash will not beat inflation. So everyone must have cash, but not for the long term. And people today really need to understand the effect of compound interest, which, as Einstein said, is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, and he who doesn't pays it. So you can either benefit from compound interest by investing and getting growth on growth on growth on growth on growth over the years, or you can take out loans and you pay interest on interest on interest on interest on interest. Which do you want? Use it to your advantage. But really what I want to talk about is compound growth from investing rather than compound interest from saving. So let's think. If you were to save into cash £100 a month for 30 years, you'd have saved £36,000. That's £1,200 a year times 30, it's £36,000. If you get 1% a year interest, which you'd be blooming lucky to do, you know, I have a Premier bank account, I get 0.35% a year interest. If you're a student, you'll get slightly better than that. But let's say you get 1% a year interest. You make the grand total of £6,159 of interest, and you're left with £42,000 at the end of the time, end of 30 years. That to me is really rubbish. And you can see there in sort of dark green right at the bottom, that's just £1,200 a year going in. And then there's the accumulated amount in brown, which is £36,000 of savings. And then the red stroke orange is your interest, which is really pretty dull. If you were to invest that money instead and get 5% a year interest for exactly the same capital outlay, £36,000, at 5% a year growth, you get £47,000 of growth. And you're left with nearly £84,000. That to me is a far more compelling argument. And so, yes, keep cash for the short term, invest for the medium to long term. Now, if you're really clever, you think, well, I'm going to get a pay rise every year. I reckon my earnings are going to go up by 2% a year. So why don't I just automate that and increase my investments automatically by 2% each year? And that means that you've actually got even more there, and your end balance is £105,000. And you can see that that orange part of the chart is far bigger, and you've more than doubled your money. Let's look at the reality. If you had invested 30 years ago, on the 7th of December 1990, you could have tracked the US stock market, the S&P 500, or indeed the FTSE All-Share or the MSCI World Index. And the annual growth rates of those indexes are 10, 8, and just under 8% per annum. You ain't going to get that with cash. So we need to put money aside for the future and live with the volatility and dot-com crashes and credit crunches and COVID. Those are all the reality and will happen in the future, or things similar to them. But by setting money aside for the long term, you win. Let's think about the climate. This is a big, big deal, as I said right at the start. Australian bushfires, floods, all that kind of stuff. The fact that we are deforesting the Amazon, the fact that our food production is unsustainable, we're using fossil fuels, climate change is a reality, and we are in the process of baking the earth. The climate in Barcelona is moving north at about 100 miles a year. It's going to be in London in 30 years' time. Now, you may say that's all great and we can all have nice suntans, but it's not very good for our crops and for our way of life and for our economy. We're not suited to that, and we've got to do something about it, and we've got to try and live in a world worth living in. And of course, there are risks and opportunities, processed food, internal combustion engines, deforestations, but there are also opportunities such as new packaging materials, nanomedical technology, electric vehicles, sustainable food production. We have to try and feed a growing population sustainably without flying our food around the world all over the place, without huge methane exhausts, etc. But how do we change that? Well, you can shower less, and this is the one slide I'll apologize for, on two counts. One, the chart on your left is Scandinavian, actually, from a Norwegian bank, and so 1,06 is actually 1.06. If you shower for 2 minutes less a day, you save a ton of CO2 emissions. If you take one less international flight a year, you save 18 tons of CO2 emissions. But actually, Nordea, a Scandinavian bank, have worked out that if you invest your pension responsibly, you have 27 times the positive impact of shortening your shower, flying less, taking the train more, and going vegetarian. Because you actually give your money to companies that are trying to do good. And if all companies were to do that, we could potentially, or you as an individual could save 2,000 tons of carbon over time. And then my second apology is on the slide on the right-hand side, because this is a non-branded presentation. And I'm not sure if you can see it, depending on where the Zoom box is on your screen. But just in our St. James's Place Sustainable and Responsible Equity Fund, which is a single fund by a single company, the activities of those portfolio companies within the fund have saved 19,000 tons of CO2. And that's the equivalent of taking 10,000 cars off the road in 2019. That's just from one fund. And the point is that if we also invest sustainably, say that St. James's Place Fund, it's just a single fund from one company in the UK, just one country of the world, and that fund is worth about £1 billion, and that takes 10,000 cars off the road. Just imagine if all investment funds in all companies across the world had the same effect. And the amount invested in stock markets around the world, according to the Visual Capitalist, is about $90 trillion. That's a 9 plus 13 zeros. And the equivalent effect of one fund, if you extrapolate it out to $90 trillion, is taking 968 million cars off the road. That's 3/4 of the world's cars. So we really can have a big impact if we invest sustainably. And I believe that the fourth industrial revolution is absolutely not about technology. It's about sustainability and looking after our planet responsibly. And we all have a responsibility to do that. Let's think a little bit about compound interest. Now, you could put money into a pension for a 1-year-old or whatever. The government will top that up a little bit. But over 10 years with government top-ups, and just for the price of a cup of coffee a day, £5 really, over 10 years, you could save for a child £35,000. And if you get 7% interest a year, you double your money every 10 years. Every 10 years, yeah. And so even without any future contributions, that £35,000 age 10 has become 70,000 age 20 and 140 at 30 and 200. And you get my point. And before you know it, you've got £1 million in a pension pot for somebody age 65, and they've got a secure income in retirement. That to me seems great, from £35,000 of contributions. Really exciting. And nothing added to it from the age of 10. So let's think about how much you might need to retire. Let's say you're a bloke, age 65. You want to take £30,000 a year gross from your pension. That's before tax. You've got a mix of investments with average, returns, and you've got a life expectancy of 86, where you're going to need a pension of £500,000 if you don't want to run out of money. If you want to retire at 60, you're going to need £650,000. Okay. How do you get that? For those of you who are students at King's, £500,000 probably sounds like an awful lot of money. But actually, the trick is to start early. Now, if there are any parents on here, we'll come on to that in a moment. But let's just assume that over time you get 7% a year returns. The government gives you 20% tax relief. Now, if you're a 40% taxpayer, you get 40% taxpayer, and additional rate taxpayers get 45. We'll completely discount company pensions and what your employer pays. But if you're 50 and don't have any pension contributions already, and you want £500,000, you've got to save £1,500 a month gross. Now, because of tax relief, that's £1,200 a month. So you'd have to write a check or a direct debit of £1,200 every month to get 500 grand age 65 if you get 7% a year returns. But if you're 40, you only have to contribute £492 a month before tax relief. And if you're 30, it's 220. And if you were just a couple of years out of King's School, Canterbury, you've only got to contribute £105 a month. And at 7% a year returns, you'll have £500,000 age 65. That to me sounds like a pretty good deal. If you can't afford to do that, just ask your grandparents or parents to do it for you. But the message is, as it says there, the earlier you start, the easier it is. So we're on the last slide, and I know that's 18 minutes or 22 minutes or something like that. The message is save cash for the short term, always have cash on hand. Be aware of inflation, always try and get above inflation returns. Invest in real assets in the stock market for medium to long-term goals. Ignore the money, take up reading the gardening section of the newspaper and let the money look after itself. Don't ignore the Far East. It's the growth area of the world. Be sustainable and invest for your future so that you can have the future that you want to have in a world worth living in. That's it from me. And over to Greg and for questions and things like that.
Thank you, Edmund. Thank you. And look, very, very informative. And it's really good to get the, what I consider the real basics out there. So here is your opportunity to ask some questions. Please type them in as we go. I'm really pleased that my first question comes from one of my tutees, Oscar. So Oscar has a question. Do you have any recommendations on credit cards, or what you're feeling on credit? You had a nice slide just before about the eighth wonder of the world. Would you recommend for students in the UK? So do you have any credit card recommendations?
Ideally, no credit cards. Credit cards, they charge you a fortune. I looked on my own credit card statement the other day, the balance of which is thankfully zero. But if I was to put money on my credit card for purchases, they would charge me 28.8% a year interest. No, thank you very much. So really for students, what I'd say is, hey, get the right current account first, with a good student deal, with cash back or with a decent interest rate, and make sure you've got the right current account. Try and save so that you've got a slush fund there that you can use. If necessary, go to mum and dad and say, Mum, Dad, I need help with living expenses. I've got my student loan, blah, blah, blah. I'll get a job to pay for my booze, but can you help with the rent or whatever at university? But if you do have to get a credit card, go for one with a 0% interest deal. I haven't looked recently at what the best options are. There are lots of comparison websites out there, and some of which will give specific deals for students. But my message is try to avoid credit cards altogether, or at least those that are going to charge you interest. I am somebody who is a young army officer in my 20s, not the 20s, that was an awful long time ago, in my 20s, I got in big trouble with credit card debt. And it took me 5 years of hard graft to pay it off. and it taught me a very good and hard lesson. And that's only spend what you can afford to spend. Now, I know that's difficult as a student. I've been a student as well. So whatever you do, try and shop around, get the right deal. Okay.
Can I just, before we go on any further questions with that, can I just explore that a little bit more?
Yeah, go for it.
If you recommend, so let's say you're a student and you recommend, okay, I think I'm going to need another, say, £100 a month, a week, say, right? So rather than get a credit card, would you recommend trying to get your parents, for instance, to help guarantee a loan of, say, 5,000 for the year, that perhaps the parents could help you control your money, and so that actually perhaps you could get a loan on that at 7%, right? So therefore actually you're paying a lot less back. I know you don't want to go into any credit, but is that a better potential model?
Absolutely. 7%, a lot better than 28%. And indeed, there are options for parents who, and there are a lot of calls on parents' money. I am one. And I've got these things called King School fees to pay and all that kind of stuff.
Worth every penny.
Of course they are. But there are lots of options. And indeed, if a young person was short of money, a parent could take out a loan. And I know I can go to Barclays or whatever and get a loan at 7 or 8% a year. And I could, lend that to my son or daughter or whatever. And that's a lot better than them paying 28% a year. Or indeed, there are other options like secured loans against investments, and which mean you don't have to encash investments. There are whole heaps of options, but big interest bills, steer clear of.
Yeah. I'm going to skip Oscar's second question and come back to, I'm going to the next one there. Are 7% returns this is from Janet Taylor, head of class 6 here at King's. Are 7% returns likely following Brexit?
I have no idea. All I know is that Brexit really affects the UK and Europe. And there is more to the world than the UK and Europe. History shows us, and I showed you that chart of the reality over the last 30 years, that you're getting 7.8 to 10% a year returns across various stock markets. There have been times when that's been negative, with dot-com crashes and credit crunches and COVID. If you had invested on the 20th of February before COVID hit, a month later you're looking at yourself being minus 15, 20 or 25% down. But I think on average, stock markets grow at about 7% a year or slightly better than that. And don't worry about Brexit, because the UK is a little spot on the edge of Europe's face, if you know what I mean. And I don't mean that sort of rudely, but there is so much more to the world than just the UK. And be global is my message to people, and use global fund managers. And I said to somebody the other day, the typical portfolio that my clients hold owns Facebook, Taiwan Semiconductors, Google, whole heaps of businesses all around the world, Samsung and things like that. So don't worry too much about the UK specifically.
Thank you. I'm going to follow that question up with something that I'll share a little secret that we perhaps discussed a couple of days ago,
right?
Virtually, which was this anonymous attendee saying sort of 7% return in the stock market sounds amazing in the current climate. However, most of us wouldn't have a clue how to invest wisely, and increases the risk. However, if you hand your money over to a manager to invest wisely, they charge 1% if you're lucky, or potentially more, maybe a bit less if you're very lucky. And this may only give you a maximum return of 2 or 3%. Sort of, what do you recommend?
Okay. It's a really good question. And I'll let you into a secret. I follow markets every single day. I look at what the FTSE is doing, what the S&P is doing, what the European indexes are doing. I look at that every single day. And when I come into work, the first thing that comes in about 7:45 every morning, there's a thing from our head office that says what's happened in the previous day. And I look at what's made stocks go up or down. I look at individual companies, but I only invest 1% of my own money. I give 99% of my money for investment to professional fund managers, because my job is to look at individuals in the face and talk about their goals and their finances and what risk profile might be right for them, how we can save them a bit of tax, how we can achieve that financial freedom for them. But I'm not the one deciding on whether to buy BP or Shell or Sainsbury's or Tesco's or Facebook or Amazon or whatever, because I don't have the time to do the analysis. I'd far rather give my money to a professional investor who employs heaps of analysts. And one of our fund managers, here we are hosted by an Australian, but by Greg, who's from Australia. One of our fund managers is actually based in Sydney. He employs 40 analysts. Each analyst spends all year just following 2 companies. And so there are 80 companies there that they follow, 40 of which are existing investments and 40 of which are potential investments. And each analyst follows one existing investment and one potential investment. And they really take years to get to know what makes a company profitable or what the risks are in that company and what the business model is. And I'd far rather give my money to somebody who does that level of due diligence. And indeed, I'd far rather give my money to, well, let's just take, for example, a fund manager I was talking to who invests in emerging markets and things like that. And they did an on-site trip in the Far East somewhere to a factory. And they walked in through a door which had a big sign on the door saying, do not keep open, it's a temperature controlled environment. And so they all walked in, closed the door behind them, and then realized all the windows were open. And they didn't invest in that company because they said, well, that's got to be no good if they're running the business like that. And I think that professional fund managers who, yes, they charge money, and for example, broadly including advice and fund manager fees, my clients pay about 2% a year, but they're still getting on average 7% a year returns over a 5-year period. That to me is good. When individual people like you and I don't have the time to think of the detailed business models of an individual company and what's going to make it profitable, where its economic advantages come from, what the risks are to that business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe in paying professional fund managers. I think they make more money than I could as an individual.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to jump to Theo's questions here, and I suppose continue on this idea of funds without getting into that nitty-gritty of specific funds. How can you ensure that the funds you invest in are truly sustainable? Or do you have to get into the nitty-gritty to find that out?
That is really important. Great question, Theo. Thank you very much. Because there is a worry that because sustainable investing is so popular at the moment, there is a concern that some funds are window dressing their offering. And in the industry, it's called greenwashing. And that to me is just silly and pointless. So there are specific fund houses that have a particularly good reputation for sustainable investing. So, and you can Google them. And I know that Royal London Asset Management, for example, have a good reputation for it. Impacts Asset Management. Hey, it comes from the word impact. All they do is sustainable investing. Cooperative Bank, they do quite a lot of sustainable stuff. But so that's that. But actually, I think what you really need is professional expertise. And this isn't me asking for a job and things like that. But if you're doing it yourself, you need to look at the sustainability reports. You need to look at what they're doing. Are they members of the UN Principles for Responsible Investing? Are they members of various other organizations such as FTSE for Good? There is the TCFD, which is the Treaty for Climate and Financial Decision Making, I think it stands for. There are various industry standards around the world that you can look, and funds should say whether they are members of, in particular, the UN Principles for Responsible Investing. And then the UN PRI gives each fund manager a grading as well, from A+, A, B, or C, or whatever. So that is a good way at looking at whether any particular fund is properly investing sustainably.
Well, I'll ask the next question, really about investing in the stock market, etc. You know, for the average Brit or Australian, you know, investing in the stock market, quite a lot of people actually just don't know how they're going to do it, right?
Yeah.
B, you know, if they look at a lot of banks, they realise that actually you can buy what's called a stocks and shares ISA,
Yep.
right? And therefore, that stocks and shares ISA, that money is protected against paying interest back to the government on the capital growth.
Yep.
And that's easy enough. You can put up to £20,000 a year, and in theory, you can just pick companies you like from the FTSE 100 or others. How do you? And I hope that that's something that people just walking a bank could, in theory, do. How do you invest in these international markets that you say, you know, you talk about fund managers? What's the first step to go about doing that?
Okay. Well, there are lots of different providers. If you want to self-invest and you want to be a DIY investor making your own decisions, there are loads of providers, and I'm not going to recommend any particular one, but you know, lots of names around the world: Hargreaves Lansdown, AJ Bell, Interactive Investor, Barclays Smart Investor. You know, lots of them have got an offering that enables you to not just invest in direct shareholdings in UK companies, but enable you to buy overseas shares. And I know that with organizations such as Hargreaves Lansdown or whatever, and they'll be the same for the AJ Bells and Interactive Investors of this world. If you want to buy Amazon shares or Microsoft shares or whatever, you can do that. So that's that. The other thing is to just invest in funds. Again, as somebody's queried that, but you might invest in a US growth fund or a Far East fund or whatever. And indeed, specifically for emerging markets and China, I would always suggest you go through a professional fund manager, because, say, in China, you've got a communist government, a state-owned, economy, where lots of the companies are state-owned, and you might have some queries over corporate governance and the effect of the government on an individual company. So I think go through a pro for that. But on more developed economies, you want to buy Novartis based in Switzerland or Amazon or whatever, or Heineken, you can do that through many of these fund shops, many of these investment shops, and they give you the option to do it. It's fine. It's easily done.
Thank you. Just a reminder, please continue to type your questions in, or put your virtual hand up even, and we can put you directly to ask Edmund for some advice. I'm going to change tack a little bit here, and I'm going to go back to the second part of Oscar's question. Particularly this is, I suppose, quite relevant for everybody here, is sort of, should I invest in the stock market or should I invest in real estate, or both?
It's a really good point. Property. Hey, we all need a house to live in, or a flat or whatever. That's great. That's a home. It's not an investment, is my view. The place I live is my family home, and I live there because I enjoy it. I hope that it will go up in value in time. Of course I do, but it's not an investment. You can have buy-to-let portfolios of flats or holiday homes or whatever. I'm not a great fan of that, mainly because of tax and liquidity. Now, that said, if you'd bought a flat in southwest London 30 years ago, you've made a really handsome capital gain. Thank you very much. And you could have spent £200,000 in 1990, and it's worth £1 million now, in Clapham or Battersea or something like that. But, it's quite penal in terms of tax buying second properties as an investment. You get a surcharge on stamp duty. You get taxed on the income. You can no longer offset all the interest of the mortgage. And then when you sell it, you pay capital gains tax with a surcharge on that. So for a higher rate taxpayer, capital gains tax in stocks and shares is 20%. If it's property, it's 28%. So the gain on a property, you're going to give about a quarter of the gain, or just over, under current rates, to the government. And the current chancellor has got his eyes on capital gains tax, and he wants to raise, or is reported to want to raise, capital gains tax. Whether that happens, I don't know. But that has been reported in the press. And also, the problem with property is illiquidity. If you have £100,000 sunk into a rental property, and you need a bit of that capital, you can't sell a window. Or you can't sell the front door. If you've got £100,000 in your stocks and shares ISA or whatever, and you want 20 grand, hey, you can have it the following week. Just withdraw it. And that's a real benefit. And with my ISA, I started my ISA age 21 in 1992, and it's been going now for nearly 30 years. And I know that 7 times I've taken chunks out of it. One of it was to pay off my credit card debt, and I was in my late 20s. So that's that. And then just occasionally for this, that, and the other, upsizing my house and things, I'll just take a bit of my ISA. It's really handy. Put in the withdrawal request, 4 days later, it's in my bank. And there's no tax liability on it. Seems fine to me. So a bit of both might well work. And I've got clients who've got rental portfolios as well as investments. But personally, I think the tax disadvantages and illiquidity are making property less and less attractive.
Now, I know you barely turned 40 yet, Edmund, but to your past self, would you have gone back and said, hang on a minute, don't have that credit card debt and keep that ISA, that ISA you had, and then all of a sudden you're paying back all this because you've got 20+% interest you're paying on that credit card debt when you were piling into the ISA. Would you have done that a different way?
Absolutely. It was a harsh lesson. I was living beyond my means for a period of time. I racked up this debt, and I wish I hadn't. And I realized this is stupid. I didn't actually have to encash all of my ISA I gradually paid off the debt. I encashed some of the ISA and then paid the rest off from income over time. But since then, I have never had more than a couple of £100 or the odd holiday on a credit card. And I don't even know the PIN number to my credit card now. I haven't used it for well over a year. And when I do use it, it's normally for big purchases that I make online because it gives you consumer protection. So just steer clear of credit card debt. Far better to talk to your bank, try and get an arranged overdraft, the first few £100 of which might be interest free and all that kind of stuff. Just really think about what you're spending your money on. And if you can't afford it, don't get it. We live in a world of now, unfortunately. And just cut your cloth.
I'm going to jump to Theo's question, and I've got another question. But we'll go to Theo's second question, actually. With so much variability in life expectancy, how can you work out how much you need to sustain the uncertainty at your desired monthly pension income?
Well, that's great. Good question. Thanks, Theo. We don't know how long we're going to live. I've got to go and pick up my eldest from St. Radigan's this evening. Who knows what might happen on the drive there. Hopefully nothing untoward. And I think this is about giving yourself optionality. And it's just about doing something to generate money in the future. And it might be, I don't know whether Theo is a student or a parent or what. I think if you've got more money than you need, well, that's great, isn't it? And if you die early, fine. Just make sure it's inheritance tax efficient, and a good advisor will be able to help you with that. And by the way, pensions are free of inheritance tax, and can go to your spouse and then on to your children with not a single penny of tax being taken off them, which is great, particularly if you die before the age of 75, where they don't even pay income tax on the withdrawals from it. But try not to die before the age of 75. None of us want to do that. So let me just have a look at that question again. I think, it's a movable goalpost, isn't it? And people often underestimate the amount of money they're going to need in retirement, because when you're working, you spend 5 out of 7 days working, and you spend 2 out of 7 days having fun. When you're retired, if you're fully retired, you spend 7 out of 7 days having fun, and your expenditure can actually go up because you can go and play golf or, sail all week or whatever floats your boat. And and you're interested in. And I think that that's part of the value of an advisor relationship. And again, this isn't about me, it's use any advisor. A good advisor will say, right, what are you going to do with your life? You know, if you weren't sitting at work today, what would you get up and do? Would you garden? Would you just drink tea? Would you have the rock star lifestyle? You know, how much do you need? And you need to just think about that. And then you extrapolate out, you add inflation of 2% a year or whatever. You say, right, let's assume I'm going to die at 98. I'm going to be spending £60,000 a year on care fees because I'll be in a gaga farm by then. And if you've got too much, well, that's a nice problem to have. The real problem is you know, when I go in front of a client and he says, well, I want £30,000 a year, and he's 60 years old or whatever, and he's got £200,000 in a pension. And I go, well, £60,000 a year, £200,000 in a pension, that's not going to last you very long. So just start early, start a conversation with an expert early, think about what you're going to need, and then give yourself the flexibility to say, well, yeah, I said I want 40 grand a year. Well, in fact, I can get by on 30 or whatever, or, you know, or maybe I've got the option of taking 50 and I'm not going to run out, you know, per annum. So it's down to the individual. Okay. There's one question, Greg, I really want to answer there. Where was it? It was about governments are borrowing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just moving on to. So government borrowing billions and billions and billions.
Yeah.
Hoping, who's lending them these billions?
Okay. There's quantitative easing going on, which is actually the government buying its own government bonds. That's actually what quantitative easing is. They're buying assets and they are holding government bonds. And a government bond, a gilt in the UK, or it's called a treasury in the US, it's basically, it's you lending to the government. And you know, the UK government might say, hey, you buy this bond, which is a 15-year bond or whatever, for which we'll pay you 1% interest a year or 1.5% interest a year. And at the end of over 15 years, you'll get your 1.5% a year, and then you get it back. You get your money back at the end of 15 years and you can trade it. So it's partly companies, it's partly pension funds, and it's partly the governments themselves. Governments themselves are sitting on trillions of dollars of their own debt. It's one reason why they want to keep interest rates low. Because while central banks are generally independent, you can bet your bottom dollar that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is saying in his sort of sidebar conversations with the Governor of the Bank of England, do what you like with interest rates, but please can you keep them really low because we can't afford the increase in our own government debt. So I think we are in a long-term era of low interest rates. And yes, I do think inflation will rise. That's not necessarily, if inflation is modest, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's a symptom of growth. If we can all afford to spend 2% more a year on coffees or school fees or cars or whatever, that is a symptom of our economy growing and us earning a little bit more, and that's fine. But more to the point, inflation will erode the real terms value of the government's debt. So if you had 100, you know, that inflation slide I showed at the start, if you had £100,000 of debt 20 years ago, that's the equivalent to £66,000 of debt now, which is great. So it's less in real terms. So a bit of inflation is not necessarily a bad thing. And governments will allow inflation to recover to about the target is 2%. I suspect they'll allow inflation to go higher than that, to maybe 2.5% or 3% for a period of time. But our governments won't actually go bust, you know, and they're not, you know, the UK government, the US government has never defaulted on its debt. And they do have emergency reserves. But I think that, again, this is a reason why we should just bear in mind that Western debt and the comparative lower level of debt in the East, and the fact that Eastern economies are going to do better. Particularly if you then think about currencies, and we are probably at peak dollar or just beyond peak dollar, and the US dollar is likely to come down a little bit, which will make Eastern economies' exports more affordable in the West, which will benefit the Samsungs of this world, who are manufacturing their products in the Far East, and it'll make it, better for the East and worse for the West. So, governments are borrowing an awful lot, but it'll take an awfully long time for them to pay it back. They will pay it back gradually over time. They want interest rates to remain low so that they can pay it back. And ultimately, they're going to raise our taxes as well. I am absolutely expecting to be stung in the next couple of years heavily by the taxman. Myself personally, they're going to raise income tax. They're going to reduce entrepreneurs' relief for business owners like me. They're going to increase corporation tax. They're going to increase capital gains tax. They're not going to do it yet, but they will do it in the next few years. Big tax rises to help pay for the debt.
Okay, final question. So let's just say I'm living a lifestyle where I'm earning £50,000 and a year, and I'm spending effectively £50,000 a year, more or less. Obviously, I'm living right on my means. You talked about cash you need in the immediate, and then savings long term. How much cash would you recommend I should have if I'm needing to live off £2,500 a month, say, right, just to live, to pay my mortgage, or rent and food and etc., mobile phone? How much do you think I need in reserve, in cash, as a safety blanket, so to speak, before I should start investing in the longer term?
Okay. Good question. Thanks, Greg. I think it's individual, and some people want to hold more cash than others. As an absolute minimum, you should hold 3 months of expenditure in the bank. So if you can't work, or if you lose your job or whatever, or if the roof blows off, hey, you've got insurance for that, but you get my point. You've got 3 months of monthly expenditure just sitting in the bank, doing nothing, not growing, getting a below inflation return, but it's there and available with no penalties, minimum of 3 months. Some people like to hold 6 months of expenditure, and then the older you get into your 70s and 80s, you might want to hold more. And but for typically working people, 3 to 6 months of expenditure. If you were 90, I'd say, hey, hold a year of expenditure in the bank, and then it really doesn't matter what happens in the stock market next year. At least you've got a year's worth of expenditure sitting there. But if you're working and accruing your normal monthly expenditure through work, 3 to 6 months should be all right.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Look, Edmund, can I just thank you so much for your advice? You kept it very general in terms of the fact that you weren't promoting your own investment company, and it was really beneficial, I'm sure, for everybody that's watching tonight, and it was really, I'm sure, enlightening for a lot as well, and sound advice for everybody, just in terms of sort of how they should be investing, where they should be investing, and the real benefits of investing in sustainable growth funds and companies going forward for the future, and the importance of that, if you can do that. So look, thank you again for your time. It's very, very kind of you, and I'm sure everybody's giving you a big round of applause through the Zoom call. Finally, I'd just like to highlight that this is our last King's Talk of 2020. Our next King's Talk is scheduled for Thursday, January the 21st, and we have Lord Alton of Liverpool, who is going to give us a fantastic insight as to, who knows if we've gone through a no-deal Brexit, or what. I'm sure it'll be absolutely fascinating to hear what he has to say about the matter, being a very staunch ex-Liberal Democrat whip. So it'll be fascinating to hear from him on January 21st. Finally, from me, it's just a final chance to say thank you very much. I know there's lots of people here that have been tuning into all the talks this academic year. Thank you for I hope you've enjoyed them. I hope you join us in 2021, and I wish everybody here a very merry and safe Christmas. Thank you very much.